Okay, so welcome back. Now today we're going to do something that you probably are going to be doing quite a bit when you're writing software, and that is being able to write your software so that you can identify and access the various devices on your computer. And you can see here we've got our device manager open in Windows, and it's got a list of all the devices that are connected to your computer. For example, we've got audio inputs, we've got cameras, disk drives, keyboards, monitors, and we've also got something that we used quite a bit previously in our videos where we have a device, typically a data acquisition device, connected to the USB serial COM port. And what we want to do is we want to go through and find out, hey, what's connected to our COM ports, to our USB ports, so that we can go and access them and interact with them. So there's a lot of devices, and depending on what you need, you're going to have to somehow figure out what devices are available, what's plugged in and available that you can access. Now, in another set of videos, we're looking at cameras. And you can see up here we've got a camera, a webcam, and that is connected via Wi-Fi. It's a smartphone, and the camera on the smartphone is connected via Wi-Fi. And we're going to look at another series of videos how we can stream that data coming from the camera over Wi-Fi to an application on our computer and show that real-time video being streamed. And in order to do that, we have to first go out and say, hey, what cameras are available? Is my camera available? If so, I need to connect to it and grab data. So we're going to show you in this video how to identify those devices, and we'll be able to access all of these different devices. And then we're going to have to figure out, once we've accessed them, what's all the data available with those devices and how can we access that data. What we're going to do is we're going to develop an application. You can see our application here, which is basically going to go out and find various devices on our computer. And I've got some buttons here, and I can either gather the COM ports, the active COM ports, or the active cameras, or I can have a button that gets all devices, that gets the lists, kind of like you see here in Device Manager. So we can try this out. I'll hit Get COM Ports, and you can see it goes out and says, hey, you've got one serial port COM4 device connected, which we saw before. And then I can say Get Cameras, and it says I've got this webcam connected. And here we can go up, and here's the webcam, and here's the serial COM port. So it's basically gathering just like our device manager. Also, I have a button here where I will get all the devices, which should give me basically all the devices as you see here in the device manager. And I'll hit that, and it goes out and says, look at all these devices. I've got 184 devices, and you can scroll through it. It's got my GPUs. It's got a whole bunch of stuff. It's got our webcam, a Logitech mouse, a microphone, all kinds of stuff. And we've also got this so that it's sorted alphabetically and prints out in our text box. So what we're going to do is we're going to figure out how to write this application. And depending on what you're looking for, the methodology is pretty much the same. You just make a few minor changes, and getting this data is really pretty straightforward. So we're going to show you how to do that. Now, before we go ahead and do that, we're going to do what an engineer might do, as opposed to what a newbie or a novice would do. We're going to go and think about how we can design this and what's involved in this. Rather than just jumping in and copying and pasting somebody's code, we're going to try to understand what we would be looking for, because in the future, 6 months in the future, if you have to redo this, it's good to have an intuitive idea of how this should work, so that you don't have to just copy and paste. You can actually understand what's going on. So if you look at the device manager, let's think about how this might be set up so that we can access all of these devices or some of these devices, and then we can grab, for example, if all we want is the COM ports, assuming there's all these devices available, how do we tell the computer, hey, I just want to access, for example, a camera or a COM port? So here in the device manager, you can see we've got a list of all these different devices. How could it be in Windows? How could it be set up that this could be available? Well, if you think about it, there's probably some sort of aspect of Windows that kind of manages all of these devices, kind of like a device manager. And it somehow is going to store a bunch of data about all of the connected devices. So how would that be? Well, maybe you can think about it being kind of like a database, right? There's a bunch of data. Maybe there's like a database in Windows or something like a database or a class of data that has all of these devices and the associated information stored in a big database. So there's probably something that we're going to want to access that handles all of these devices, kind of as a device manager. So the first thing we're going to have to think about is, what are we going to do in our application, in our Visual Studio Windows Forms C# application? We may need to connect to some sort of device manager libraries or software that will allow us to get the data. So the first thing we're going to have to think about is, what are we going to need? Are we going to need to access some libraries, to add some references? Maybe we need something like that to get connected to the device manager. So that's the first thing. What else are we going to need? Well, if we're going to, for example, search for whatever cameras are available, we're going to have to ask the device manager, or whatever that is, we're going to have to make kind of a query or a search of the database. So if you know anything about databases, you know that it's kind of common in databases to have queries, like SQL queries or something like that, which is a kind of a text command that says, hey, I just want, for example, give me a list of all the connected cameras. So we know we're going to have to find some sort of library or reference, some sort of DLL or something to get access to all of these. And then we're probably going to need some sort of query to query individual components that we can access. So let's look at our simple application in Visual Studio C# Windows Forms and see what we've got. So here is our application, and really there's not a whole lot to it. We've got our design, which is basically a text box that we've added, and we've got a vertical scroll bar. Here I've got the text box selected. You can see scroll bars set to vertical, and I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 buttons that we've added. Just drag and drop from the toolbox, 4 buttons, and one is for getting the COM ports, one for getting the cameras, one for getting all devices, and one for exit. We've also got a label and a text box. And what this is going to define is, if I'm going to get all the devices, I can specify what data I want to get on those devices. And we'll talk about that in a bit, but this just allows user input to define what we want to get about all the devices, and it's going to give us a default value. But basically we've got 4 buttons, and we're going to have event handlers for each of the 4 buttons. And of course, to get those, you just double click on each and we'll have our event handlers. So here is the code that we're going to have. Really, it's basically everything you see right here. We've got our using statements, our public partial class form 1, and we've got some stuff here, not a whole lot. Our form 1 initialized component. And here we just have we're setting the default value on this text box, this property text box, and we are giving it a default value. And then we've got our methods, which are going to do the work, and our event handlers for our buttons. So let's take a look. First, we've got our using statements. We've got using system.collections.generic, because we're going to have some lists. They're going to list all of our devices. And then we've got something that we talked about before. There is what's called a system.management using statement. So we're going to have a reference to system.management, and that is going to be the library that manages the devices. So to do that, we're going to go to our project, right-click, add reference, and we're going to go to assemblies, and we're going to scroll down to system.management. And this is going to be the library that is managing all of the devices. So make sure that is checked, and that will give us access to be able to get information about the devices. And then we're going to need our using system.management. And that's the really important part of this. And then using system.windows.forms. So my namespace, my solutions while finding devices. And what we're going to start out with is some lists of strings. And basically, we're going to ask this system.management for whatever devices we want, either the COM ports or the cameras or all devices. And we're going to put all of the results that we get from asking system.management, we're going to put all of those into lists of strings. So that's why I've got 3 lists of strings. One for COM port names, one for camera names, and one for all devices. So we're just defining those. And then I have our default value for our device property, which is called caption. And when we go for all devices, we are going to access the caption property that is going to give us all of the names of those devices, those 184 devices. So we're starting out with initialize component, and then we're saying our text property.text is this caption device property. And then we've got our methods and event handlers. So we'll first start with the event handlers. We've got a button for if we want just the ports, if we want the cameras, if we want all devices, and then one for the exit. And as you can imagine, when we click on these, it's going to call a method to get either the ports or the cameras or all devices or just exit. BTN ports, and what that's going to do is it's going to populate our list of COM port names, which we have up here, and it's going to call get ports. And then once it's got that list, for each string port in COM port names, it's going to append our text box with that port name plus a carriage return line feed, all right? And that's the basic format for all of these buttons. You basically call our method to get a list of all of the devices in that category, and then for each string in that list, just print it to the text box. We've got that for the ports, and for the cameras, you can imagine exactly the same. And we're going to say our list of camera names is get cameras, and we're going to call this get cameras method up here. And then for each string camera and camera names, append the name to the text box. Now, for the all, it's going to be a little bit different, but pretty much the same. And it's going to be device names, a list of all the device names. We're going to call get all devices. But in this case, we're also going to sort that list. And all we have to do to alphabetically sort it is say device names.sort. And that will take all these device names and make them sorted alphabetically. And then we go back to what we had before for each string device and device names, append it to the text box. Now we're also going to, for all of these, we're going to have a count how many devices are in that list of device names, and we're going to append that to the text box. So append text, we do a carriage return line feed, number of devices, and just take the device names.count, convert that to string, and that will give us our count of how many devices. In our case, it was 180 something, and that was all of the devices that we've listed. The methodology for these buttons is all exactly the same, and application exit for the exit button. So now let's take a look at the real workers, which are these methods that are going to somehow access the system management and do some sort of search to get the appropriate devices that we want to list. So we'll start out with our get ports, and it's returning a list of string, and it's called get ports. So we're starting out by defining an internal variable, which is a list of the port names, and it's a new list of string. This is the basic code that we're going to use to grab whatever devices we want from the device manager. So now let's first look at the Microsoft documentation that will help us understand a little bit more about how this is all laid out. We talked about the system.management namespace, and we added a reference to system.management. And here we are in the learn.microsoft.com under learn.net API browser system management namespace. I encourage you to take a look at that if you want to have a better understanding on what you can do with all of this. But in our system management.namespace, says provides access to a rich set of management information and management events about the system, devices, and applications instrumented to the Windows Management Instrumentation, or WMI infrastructure. And you're going to see that terminology, WMI, a little bit later. But you can access, using this, a lot of information about system, devices, and applications. And they're using the Windows Management Instrumentation infrastructure, okay? So applications and services can query for interesting management information, such as how much free space is left on the disk, current CPU utilization, which database a certain application is connected to, and much more. So you can get a lot of information using this. And they're saying it's using classes derived from what's called the Management Object Searcher and Management Query. So before we were saying, well, we've got probably this big database of devices. How are we going to query it or search it? Well, they tell you right here, you use the Management Object Searcher. And we're going to utilize that to search that database of devices to get what we specifically want, either a COM port or a camera, in our case, or all devices. So let's click on Management Object Searcher, and this is the class that does the searching of all those devices. And as you can imagine, we're going to have to give this some sort of query to get the specific information we want. So how do we do that? Well, what we're going to use is what's called WQL, which is kind of like a sequel for the Windows Management Instrumentation. So really, we're going to be doing like a SQL query for that searcher, and it's called WQL. And it's the WMI query language, or WQL, is a subset of the ANSI structured query language, or SQL, that you may be familiar with. And it's got some minor semantic changes, so it's not exactly SQL, but it's WQL. It's a subset, so it's got a lot fewer keywords. And if you go to the learnmicrosoft.com under Windows Server WMI WQL, you can see all of the keywords. They've got and, from, is a, like, not, no, or, and so on. So as you can imagine, you can see under not, they've got this select star from something where, and this looks a lot like SQL, and we're probably going to be using something like this select, like we do in SQL, to grab whatever specific devices we want. So now we know that we're going to do like a SQL query and something to do with this Management Object Searcher. So let's now look at our code and see how we do it. So we'll start out with our get ports. And again, this is going to return a list of string with all of the port names. And locally, we're going to have a list of string port names as a new list of string. And we're going to use this Management Object Searcher, and we are feeding it a WQL query. It's a string, and we're select from whatever, and we're specifically asking for the COM ports. We're going to use a using statement, and we're going to call our searcher, and we're going to instantiate a new Management Object Searcher and feed it this WQL query. And the query is like SQL, select star from, and then we're going to the next line, and we're selecting what are called the Win32 plug-and-play entities. So everything we're dealing with here is going to be plug-and-play devices, like our USB, where you plug it in and it automatically recognizes it. So it's called the Win32_PNP entity, where the caption looks something like COM and with any characters before or after the COM, and that's going to select everything that has a caption. It's called the caption that looks like COM. So what is caption? So here we are in the learn.microsoft.com Windows Management, or WMI, Windows Management Instrumentation, Win32 WMI providers, and we're at the Win32 PNP entity class. And as expected, it's got a lot of properties. And you can see here, it lists all of the different properties that you can access. availability, caption, which we are using, which is going to give us kind of a description of the device, class GUID, compatible ID, a whole bunch of stuff that we can access, install date, hardware ID, manufacturer, name of the device. So there's a whole lot of information here, but we're just going to go through and give the user ability to define which of these properties you want to access from each of the devices in that list of devices. Again, you can use anything you want here. Any of these properties, you can enter those into our text box. So we are going to use the caption, and now that we've got our searcher, we are going to go for each device in searcher.get, and this basically takes the searcher and invokes the specified WMI query and returns the result. So this actually takes this query and goes and gets the values for all of the devices listed in this searcher. We're going to go for each device, and we're going to get that caption converted to string and add it to our list of port names. So we instantiate the new Management Object Searcher with a query. We are going to step through all of those return devices, and we are going to convert the caption name for each of those devices to string and add them to our list of port names. And then when that's all done, we're going to return our list of port names. All right. So really very straightforward. And you can imagine when we do it for cameras, for example, our next one, it's going to be almost identical. So we do get cameras, list of string camera names, a new list of string, using var searcher, new management object searcher, and we have a different query. Select all from Win32 PNP entity where the PNP class is image or PNP class is camera. And we'll talk about this in a little bit more depth in our series where we're going to be grabbing some available cameras over Wi-Fi and showing the streaming images. But where the PNP class is image or PNP class is camera, and we're doing the exact same thing. We are getting all those devices and printing out the caption for each of the devices and returning that list. So pretty straightforward, the same procedure. For get all devices, we are getting list of string device name, and we are saying the device property is whatever the user has put into this property text box, or the default if they haven't changed it. And again, we're going through var searchers, new management object searcher, select all from Win32 PNP entity. So we have no qualifiers. It's just all of the devices under Win32 PNP entity. We want to get all the devices. And then for each var device in searcher.get. And here what we're doing is if there is a legitimate response, we are going to add it to our list. Otherwise, if the property is null, this makes sure there's no null input. If the property is not null, then we are going to add it to our list and return it. But this is just kind of a check to make sure that all of the devices have a property in them. And basically that's it for getting all the devices. So now you can get into details, and we may do this in a future video, on how to get like event data and all kinds of stuff associated with these devices. But at least this gets us in the ballpark and gets us the ability to access all of our devices. And again, in another set of videos, we're going to be using this where we're going to grab camera video. We're going to stream camera video into a C# application we're going to build over the Wi-Fi, and we're going to use this technique to figure out what cameras, even if there are more than one camera available, what cameras do we get and what cameras do we stream. So that's about it for this one. If you like any of these videos, please hit the like button, subscribe, hit the bell notifications, but most of all, please let others know that we're here so we get some views. Really appreciate it. Otherwise, take care. Have a really good day. Thanks.